In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It would be easy to read this story from Exodus and say that it's a story about Moses. After all, this is the first time we see Moses' name, and he's clearly the star. We know what happens after Moses grows up. He ends up leading the Hebrew people out of Egypt. But this story is not about Moses. Well, then it must be about Pharaoh. And he's an important guy, clearly very powerful. But it's not about Pharaoh either. If it were about Pharaoh, we'd probably have a name for him. We don't. This story is not about the powerful. It's about the powerless. At least the people who were perceived to be powerless. It is full of humor, irony, and intrigue. It starts with a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, which means he didn't know the story of Joseph. He didn't know how this Israelite had actually saved Egypt from a devastating famine, which brought more Israelites into Egypt. This Pharaoh was probably only alive because of that Israelite named Joseph, who lived long ago. He was at a disadvantage because of his self-inflicted ignorance. He also seemed a bit paranoid, or possibly just horribly insecure. He was worried that if the Israelites continued to increase in number, they would join the enemies of Egypt and overthrow him. So he oppressed them. Because as we know, that's always an effective way to keep people in line. He also hoped that by working them so much, they would not procreate as much, that they would not have the time and the energy. Alas, this plan did not work. The more they were oppressed, the more numerous they got. The Pharaoh called on two Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Now, midwives were usually women who were barren, who did not have families. Barren women were pretty much the lowest social status you could be in this time, since a woman's main reason for being was procreation. The Pharaoh asked these women to kill all the male babies. The girls didn't worry him. The midwives feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, so they didn't do it. Now, a lot of people are uncomfortable with this idea of fear of God. The word translated to fear, though, is a tricky one. There's no direct translation from the Hebrew. A translation that might be more understandable is honor. They honored God more than they honored Pharaoh. They knew that Pharaoh's power was temporary and that God's is eternal. They didn't tell him they refused, they just didn't obey. When Pharaoh realized that all these babies were still being born and still alive, he brought them back and questioned them. Now, the response is pretty hysterical if you think about it. They essentially said, these Hebrew women are just popping out these children so fast, we can't even get there in time. And apparently he bought that. The Pharaoh then called on all the Egyptian people to throw every male baby into the Nile so that they would drown. But one woman hid her child and put him in a basket in the Nile River. When we hear basket, we think of a flimsy wicker thing. But this was no ordinary basket. The Hebrew word translated to basket in this text is actually translated to ark in the story of Noah and the ark. It's the only time those two words are used. So clearly the mother of Moses had put some time and some effort into this little ark. She wanted the child to be carried to safety, much like God wanted the ark to carry people and animals to safety. Now, as luck would have it, the daughter of Pharaoh just happened to be bathing by the river as she saw this little ark passing by. Of course, we know luck had nothing to do with it. God wanted her there. She knew this was a Hebrew child, a child that her father had ordered to death. But compassion moved her her when she saw this child and heard his cries. I'm sure she knew about her father's policy, but seeing this horrific policy at work must have been more than she could bear. So she pulled him out of the river. She knew that the ark, while sturdy, could not last forever without her intervention. So the daughter of Pharaoh disobeyed her own father and saved the one man who would end up delivering an entire nation. It is fascinating to me that while the Pharaoh was so intent on killing all the males, it was the females, the ones who were already alive, who would be the means of his undoing. He feared that the Israelites would become so numerous that they would create an army. They didn't need an army. They needed a couple of women who were considered completely powerless, who would risk their own safety to save a child and to honor God. Now, the Pharaoh's daughter was probably not a worshiper of the one true God, but maybe she was. Jewish rabbis have guessed or surmised that she was at the river to cleanse herself of idolatry because she had discovered the one true God. There's absolutely no evidence to prove this, but it's an interesting idea. What we know is that she was moved by compassion, a compassion that moved her to sacrifice her own interest for that of another. And that is love in its truest sense. And God is love. There's another theory that the rabbis have for this story. They wrote that it was not a maid of Pharaoh's daughter who pulled the baby out of the water. It was actually her own arm. The Hebrew word for arm and maid is very similar. However, her arm extended to double or triple its length as she went to reach for this child, thus allowing her to pull him out of the river. We hear the phrase divine intervention all the time, but God has always been fond of using human intervention for his divine purposes. Sure, he could have destroyed the Egyptians in some fantastic way and carried the people of Israel out in a cloud of glory. That's not how God usually operates. God likes humans to intervene. God especially loves to use those people who would be considered powerless by most. The Hebrew midwives had nothing but their courage and their faith in God. Moses' mother had nothing but love, courage, and faith. The Pharaoh's daughter probably had more power than most women in that time, but still not very much. The power that each woman had was her willingness to risk her life for another. And that is a power that God honors. That is a power that Jesus wielded centuries later to save all of humanity. There are so many times in life when people do not act because they feel powerless or overwhelmed. They are powerless to change themselves or their lives or the world around them. But God proves again and again that power does not come with wealth, prestige, or connection. Power comes with an openness to the will of God, to the possibility of something better. We think that we can only reach as far as our own arm will extend. Yet when we reach out our arm in love, God will always stretch us in ways that we never expected. And we will find that we are more powerful than we ever imagined. Amen.